Turn on the recording. So it's nice to see you all back again. Still some four presentations to go. The first one will be by Sampath. We have known each other for quite a few years, we could say. It's a pleasure to have you, Rai.
Thank you. Thank you.
If you're up for it, you can start.
Okay. Thank you, Alfred, again. Thank you so much for bringing us together and for this conference. And I wish we can meet in person someday. We can do that. I will begin my paper by sharing it, and then we can proceed. I hope to go for maybe 20 minutes of reading. That's it, because then we can have more of a discussion. Otherwise, this paper, the way I've started, it may take a few hours to read. So I'll keep it very brief, just the first few pages. So let me share that. I'm mindful of the fact that many of you speak other languages as your first language. I tend to speak very fast in English because this is the country I grew up in. You know, maybe 10% of some Indian languages, but my main Geist and Dasein is in American English. So if it's too fast, Alfred, you just tell me, or someone tell me to go slow, and I can go slower. And of course, during our discussion, we can come back to German and, quite frankly, Spanish and other languages. So the title of my talk, if everybody can see that, is Between Heidegger's 1936 lecture on Schelling and Schelling's 1809 treatise on the essence of human freedom, lies a secret Hegel. So I'm being a bit cryptic there. What do I mean by secret Hegel?
Can you make the text a bit larger?
Yes, I can. How about this?
Yeah, that's better.
Okay. So I'll just start reading slowly. Like I said, there are about 4 parts to the paper. I'll give a summary of the 4 parts after I stop reading, but let's start with the beginning here. So this is the introduction. Schelling's system of transcendental idealism, 1800, predates Hegel's phenomenology of spirit by 7 years. In many respects, has many structural components that would appear in the phenomenology, even though we know Hegel famously mounts his critique against Schelling, and therefore Fichte and Kant before him, raises the stakes of the Western philosophical project in general, introduces new terms and a method, and takes us into realms deep in the phenomenology on revealed religion and absolute knowing that Schelling or others could not go. And in fact, those sections in Hegel over 200 years ago still remain mysteries that no one has really expanded to the depths Hegel himself attempted, but cut short in the final chapter we received as absolute knowing. I don't want to be disrespectful. Those of you that know the Anglo-American scholarship, and quite frankly, the German and French. I know less about Spanish and Italian scholarship, but in the Anglo-American world, Charles Taylor's generation, Robert Pippin, Terry Pinkard, et cetera, so many different generations have probed, of course, have given us new insights into Hegel, but my focus has always been on absolute knowing, the very last chapter of the phenomenology, which some argue is the most difficult. Yes, that is the Hegel we know. And he, more than anyone else in his time, and therefore after some can argue, made the metaphysical problem of time, movement, and history more complex than it had ever been posed before. But then just 2 years after the phenomenology, another Schelling emerges. He was 5 years younger than Hegel, as we know, he got an earlier start. This other Schelling comes up with his most mysterious and untimely work, the philosophical investigations into the essence of human freedom. So as Hegel builds the abstract system and secures his own immortality through the science of logic, 12 and 16, the 3-part encyclopedia, 1817, this other Schelling ages, some may say is a proto-postmodern, insofar as he taught the first great critics of incipient Western modernity, namely Kierkegaard and the early Marx. Reflections on freedom, finitude, and the mystery of time and becoming, and the self-revelation of the absolute. This is my brief sort of crystallization of his work. God is a becoming in and of its own ground, and the non-ground, remember that's both, of the indifference neutral to all opposites. So something neutral to opposites distinctions in this movement event in the ground. It may not be, and I'm not saying it is, it may not be a pure foreshadowing of Nietzsche's later works to come. That would be his genealogical destruction of everything and the highest thought of the eternal return. Of course, we know in this lecture, Heidegger will bring Schelling and Nietzsche into discussion many times. I put this into, it's certainly not dogmatic Trinitarian Christian theology with which we can compare and contrast. something different to the Christian structure. Nevertheless, brave as he was, Schelling appears decades before Nietzsche at a moment when the known Western European world was not ready for such an abandonment of all that had been thought in Western philosophy up to that age. And he, Schelling, is the absent bridge, the suspended bridge cast into oblivion between Hegel, who culminates the Western metaphysical tradition, while pointing to some other and all post-Hegel attempts to reckon Hegel without truly escaping from his grasp, despite all announcements that Hegel is dead. Very, very contorted sentence. I'll try to elaborate. The following reflection will not ask whether Schelling's 1809 response to Hegel's 1807 phenomenology to Schelling's 1800 work is correct. So the 1809 work by Schelling is a critique of Hegel's phenomenology, which of course critiques and appropriates the transcendental system of 1800. This is not a scholarly reflection on the merits of either Schelling or Hegel to tackle the question of the absolute, spirit, notion, truth, in post-Kantian German idealism and its metaphysical aspirations. Rather, this is a conference on Heidegger. Returning to Schelling's text, one can revivify attempts to go into Heidegger's labyrinthine 1936 lecture on Schelling's treatise on the essence of human freedom. It is a time that was contemporaneous with Heidegger's monumentally ambitious Beiträge. We heard Marco's wonderful talk yesterday on the Beiträge, and his audacious rebuttal of Nietzsche as the last metaphysician in his famous lectures, which also began in 1936. The English translation of the Schelling lecture of Heidegger, of the Schelling lecture of 1936, there's the reference, contains an appendix of excerpts from manuscripts from an advanced seminar on Schelling in 1941 that was transcribed by Heidegger's brother Fritz. Within that appendix is titled a section called Temporality as Ecstatic Temporalizing. We spent a lot of time yesterday talking about this question of temporality, the relationship between being and time and Beiträge with Marco's talk. So I'll be coming back to that in this discussion. But here in this appendix and in this section, it's where Heidegger reflects on his own work, Being and Time. Later, Heidegger in 1936, looking back, as he's starting the Beiträge, looking back at Being and Time, he states, I quote, "We must bring closer to the mode of thinking within which the present discussion with Schelling moves. It is not important to emphasize a perspective of one's own, nor to defend an originality which appears threatened. However, the difficulty remains that we must speak of what is our own. Self-deception is inevitable when a temporal distance from what was said earlier is present. He's distant from what was said earlier, being in time. He's now present. What is the distance? I'm not saying that being in time has become something past for me. See, I've still not gotten any further today because I know with ever increasing clarity that I must not get any further. But perhaps I've gotten closer in some things to which was attempted in Being in Time. We take Being in Time as the name of a reflection whose necessity lies far beyond the deed of an individual who cannot, quote unquote, invent this necessity, but also cannot master it. Thus, we can distinguish the necessity designated by name, Being in Time, from the book with this title. Being in Time is a name for an appropriation in being itself. Being in Time is the formula for reflection within the history of thinking. Being in Time is the title of a treatise which attempts to bring about this thinking. That this book has its faults, I believe I know myself. Here it is like climbing a never-climbed mountain because it is steep and at the same time unknown. Whoever climbs here sometimes falls. The wanderer has suddenly gone wrong. Sometimes he also falls without the reader noticing it, for the pages do go on. One can even fall several times here. But one should not talk too much about this, nor make too much of it. These remarks already overstep the line. Inevitably, of course, because today we can hardly find our way to the necessities reigning within themselves without such aids. Nietzsche once said, with a different intention, however, one only has the courage, very late, for that which one really knows. One only has the courage very late for that which one really knows. We might add that, too, which one knows in the realm of thinking, which attempts to think being, is after all, each time, only a light surmised which hovers over something which far outreaches the thinker. That's Heidegger in this appendix to the English translation of the 1936 Schelling lecture. So back to my text, that was a quote from Heidegger. I'll read this. We must meditate on this passage as it sits within the appendix, which also includes plans for another seminar from 1941 to 1943, as it is included in the whole of the 1936 lecture. We can't move quickly on this, other than appreciate the unsurprising humility of Heidegger, typical, authentic mode of questioning and self-assessment. He has to dismiss any superficial ascription of the new or the originality in his previous undertaking in Being and Time, or what follows it. Socratically, one can say in terms of the famous dictum, Heidegger really knows his own limits, those very limits of Western metaphysics itself, while trying desperately to proffer the other beginning and to awaken thought once again. This is a repeated theme, as we all know, in the later Heidegger on the history of being and his lectures on previous great philosophers. We find this often. He goes back to Being and Time, acknowledges its limits and gaps, but breathes new interpretive life into it by claiming that what he was doing in the later period in fact gets deeper into the mystery of Being and Time itself. It's not a question of going further in terms of revolutionary philosophical creativity, but getting closer, as he says, but also leaving behind the earlier author and perhaps his naive intent. Those of you that are familiar with the French edition, this of course is his assumption, and one can argue that although French thinkers have come up with creative responses to Heidegger, Blanchot, Levinas, Derrida, no one has gone farther either, because going further is not what is at stake. Or we would have to have a mistaken view of what advancement, quote unquote, in continental philosophy means these days. Finally, Heidegger's quotes Nietzsche on thinking too late what one already knows. And that unique attempt when it comes each time to think being is a light which hovers over something that goes far beyond the thinker. We all know, as Heidegger scholars, that secondary interpretations in philosophical scholarship is saturated with vigorous debates on the relation between the earlier and later Heidegger, the care, turning away, turning around, turning within, many different ways to think about care, from the early project attempting fundamental ontology and the period that marks the history of being, truth of being, Eigness, event appropriation. This juncture, we do not want to get into the domain or retread those debates. So here I'm coming almost to the main point of my talk, which as you see will end right there. So just 2.5 more pages. Let me come back to the main thing I want to discuss. Instead, one can read the actual Schelling work of 1809 in response to what Hegel leaves us with in the last sections of Phenomenology of Spirit on revealed religion and absolute knowing, particularly on time, death, finitude, evil, the man-God Christological substance, and its overcoming in pure speculative philosophy. A double movement event we see in absolute knowing, in which neither substance nor subject return to the previous positions they occupied in the history of Western metaphysics, the ancient Greeks, Kant, Fichte, Schelling up to Hegel, and Christian theology. Here's my very ambiguous, so not unambiguous, not clear, attempt to crystallize. There are many different ways we can interpret what's happening in absolute knowing. But here's me giving my own sort of interpretation, just very briefly. The whole as the movement of moments as they raise themselves up from the incomplete shapes, re-interiorized for what they truly are, and raising up when the new world is born, which is spirit knowing itself as the notion of its time, not just the notion's time or the notion being in time. Spirit will appear when it no longer appears within time. Heidegger gets into this at the very end of Being in Time. So I'm putting it here in the very beginning. Come back to it. But in a moment, we can present a long Schelling passage that absolutely teases the imagination to go further than this. A rude Hegel-Schelling synthesis scintillates with possibility. But then to take seriously the effort in Heidegger's 1936 lecture, including these cryptic remarks in the appendices on the notes and excerpts for a future seminar, we must not jump so high as to be naive, as Heidegger cautions, without risking falling off the mountain. Ecstatic temporality from being time comes back, but with deeper, richer intonations. On the previous page of the quote above from the appendix, Heidegger states in the 1936 lecture, the concept of existence, I'm not going to say Dasein, and he doesn't say it either. He just says concept of existence in being and time arises from the question named by this title. In the development of this question, a reflection on the essence of time became necessary. That includes a historical discussion of the previous interpretation of the essence of time. We must distinguish between one, preconceptual calculating of time, the time of the day, time of the year, calendar time, clock time, excuse me. Two, from here, the possible conceptual formulation of the essence of time, thus projected. Here, a preconception of being is decisive. He gets this from the ancient Greeks. Since time somehow exists, being of time, time is predicate for being, existence, not ecstatic existere, existing out, just in the Greek conception, which of course he'll destroy. Greek chronos, corresponding to topos, calculated counting time, datum, given, presencing time, time is dated. Tauta gariestino chronos, arithmos kinesis kata toproteron, kai hysteron. That's transliterated Greek, as you know. Tode proteron, ke hysteron, and tapa protonestin. Modern as the dimension and scheme of order for all events in human procedure. Time as parameter, the peri, the round, measured along which points and distances can be measured. So don't want to simplify the Greek structure here, but that's number two. Three, there's another time shape, you can say, in the history of the West. The question of time with regard to the temporally limited journey, experienced in a Christian way of the individual human soul on earth, temporality and eternity. Throughout being and time, so many references to theology. Goes back to Kierkegaard. Kierkegaard is stuck in the eternal now. Augustine's soul is extended temporality. He too is stuck. So Kairos, Christianity, this is being critiqued by Heidegger as well. And in fact, he goes to the famous myth, Care crossing the river, in chapter 6 of Division 1 on Sorga. So he gives us another version of what he means by care, stretched lived time. And then fourth, this is Heidegger's contribution. This is his great breakthrough. Time is the first name for the projective realm of the truth of being. Time is the ecstatic time space, the Spiel realm. And we get that in the Beiträge. Get that throughout the late Heidegger. Ecstatic between time space, not the wherein of beings, but the opening of being itself. So back to my text. We must consider the obscurity of this fourth possibility after the three, I say three specifically, that Heidegger lists. The mystery of four in general haunts Heidegger's and our undertaking, so not just Heidegger's. Yes, let us go back to the unfinished work of being in time, but not where Heidegger leaves off at the opening. We must go back to the actual text of Schelling, and in a dream where time becomes available again, return to those last sections of the phenomenology by Hegel in the Schelling, creation forming forth from his own finitude, the infinitude. That's the concluding Schiller poem at the end of the phenomenology. Time fills itself up in this fourth designation that Heidegger gives us from the aforementioned quote. Heidegger wants to place both Schelling and Hegel in terms of the last two great figures of German idealism, with Schelling as the acme, the highest point. And truth be told, the 1809 Schelling comes after the phenomenology. Hegel's system is built until 1820. He dies in 1830. And of course, we know that Schelling lived much longer in obscurity to a certain extent, but still lectured and never published anything in that period. Schelling as the acme of Western metaphysics in general, but also Nietzsche's reversal of everything. That is, in response from the ancient Greeks to German idealism of Kant and Fichte, as the farthest subjectivity in the Western tradition is gone. This is the culmination and completion of the first beginning of Western philosophy. Whereas Heidegger thought with both being and time, and now in the 1936 self-reflection and critiques of its limits, the critique of being and time, constitute a different beginning, which is only more authentic in its relation with the first beginning. Most of all, Heidegger does not begin with subjectivity. I'm going to make this point very clearly, as you'll see in the rest of my work. I don't want to equate Dasein at all with existence and the human. You can say, wait a minute, you don't understand being in time. You don't understand Heidegger. What are you talking about? Well, let's debate that. Let's see what we mean. Most of all, Heidegger does not begin with subjectivity, and in that the human subject, regardless of whether most think of Dasein from being in time as existence, and in the human as opposed to animal existence. Derrida, others have exploited this question, that why come Heidegger doesn't talk about animal, only talks about human. Going back to Heidegger, Heidegger's reflections constitute a historical thinking that must be undertaken so we have a proper appropriative relation with the first beginning that culminates in German idealism and Nietzsche's reversal. We must move away from subjectivity altogether because the ground that opens up is not the dust to which humans return when they die after the fall in Genesis. So we're almost done with the text and then I'll be finished. 12:20, started at 12:45. Yep, so we'll have plenty of time for discussion. How can we continue writing in the margins of Heidegger's appendix while revisiting passages in both Schelling and Hegel and blow up their speculative potentialities? That is the task of the following pages, which we will lay out in sketches and notes of an ongoing research program. Obviously, I can't discuss that here. I'll give you a quick summary before I close. But simultaneously, how can we be responsible and responsive to Heidegger's admonitions against the metaphysical impulse of subjectivity and the will, unless we completely misunderstand his project of the historical thinking? The latter is a true reckoning of why the metaphysics of German idealism ended up where it did with Hegel and Schelling, meaning in a crisis. That's really Schelling's work. Simply put, are we speaking from the standpoint of a human subject, given its remarkable variety of civilizations, cultures, and languages, whether Western or Eastern, global North or global South, neo-colonial or post-colonial? Both ontology and the pursuit of the question of being, and theology and the attempt to conceptualize God as ground, have degraded themselves in the Western metaphysics of subjectivity, or what Heidegger would later term the ontotheological constitution of metaphysics, especially in Identity and Difference, 1957. The first beginning launched a positioning between truth and being that was fatally flawed and doomed to exhaust itself. Something else was covered over, which seems impossible to retrieve. The movement from substance to subjectivity marks the movement from the origin of metaphysics with the ancient Greeks, particularly Aristotle's metaphysics, to Kant's transcendental revolution up to Hegel's speculative philosophy. All of this is what Heidegger's Being and Time challenges, destroys, section 6 of Being and Time, and tries to overcome by returning to the question of the meaning of being and posing the question anew and the meaning of question. We talked about Daniel's project yesterday, meaning living in the question, living as question. Remember, it's not just the question of the meaning of being, but the meaning of the question. And this is no hermeneutic circle, a la Dilthey and his legacy. We're not thinking of the human as the subject that produces and interprets history and the object that is understood as a historical subject to be studied and discovered. The horizon that is time makes its announcement, but is not derived from the history of conceptions of time, particularly for Western humanity, from the pre-Socratics to Descartes, to Kant, to Hegel, to Schelling, to Kierkegaard, to Nietzsche, to Husserl, or to Heidegger's time, both philosophy and, of course, the Catholic priests, Protestant theologians of his time. Although the words time and temporality make their appearance in the table of contents of Being and Time, we all know that what is buried in the work is one massive event. Heidegger said that earlier in the quote we offered. And furthermore, just to summarize again, that list, how do we take forward his attempt to explore time as the projective realm of the truth of being, ecstatic between time-space as the very opening of being, as a response to the incompleteness of being and time and its missing division 3. Alfred knows and others that I'm obsessed with this and have been my whole life. It's missing division 3. This would be in contrast to the previous epochs where time was reckoned, the list I mentioned, calculating time, ancient Greek time, datable time, the temporal journey, Christian, time eternity, the eternal present, and then Heidegger, the opening of being, time as the horizon and the meaning of being and being in time. It's the last question of being in time. Okay, this is where I end, and then I can stop. And the presuppositions of this task do not derive from one notion of a simple linear chronological history of time, but derives the history of time and the temporalization of history remains an enigma within all of Heidegger's corpus and those of us who follow after him. To simply repeat the archaeological and empirical record of history from ancient civilizations to our historical present misses the point. We are not physical anthropologists. All of us in this group, philosophers, we're not physical anthropologists. We're not evolutionary biologists who probe the mystery of the animal and the threshold that gave birth to the Homo sapien and their parallel ancestors. If you keep up with modern, this is me, I'm not reading the text, but if you keep up with modern physics and theoretical physics, relativity and quantum mechanics attempts to unify them, it's grand unification theory, the theory of everything, from the big to the small, the parallel universe. Now they're talking about time doesn't exist. It's all ontic. We know that from Heidegger. That's all spatialized thinking. He says that on Time and Being. Physicists get all the credit, talking about the mystery of time, Einstein, but we know that's not the ontological project. So we're not talking about that. Instead, the ecstatic projection, all that comes from some other source that always withdraws or conceals itself. And in fact, we are the ones who are most concealed within that concealment. Only a God can save us. This is my transition. The deconstructed phenomenology of anti-Christianity and anti-scientific evolution awaits articulation, a place inaugurated at least in modern philosophical consciousness with Schelling and then Nietzsche. Let us try to unconceal what lies in this darkness. And so I've stopped here, and as I mentioned, this is page 6 of 26. The basic building blocks is obviously I have to take us through Schelling, which I do in some very intriguing passages on the final crisis and the ground. Take us back to Hegel. I pass through again at one section that I'm sort of working on now in the Bible, which is Genesis 3, where the serpent meets Isha, woman, before she becomes Eve, and is tempting her, having this discussion about that side of the fall, before she bites, before birth, death, and sin come into existence. So I play around in this structure for a while. This is all for not for nothing, because I then come back to, excuse me. I take that passage from the Bible and I set that up to come back to Heidegger himself, having passed through some Aristotle, 1931, on the problem of movement as completely undiagnosed, the being of movement and the being of time itself. This is in the 31 lecture on Aristotle. Again, but the main point is to transition to what I really want to get to, which is an extended commentary on section 65 of ecstatic temporality and the missing division 3. So let me stop there and tell you, what does this all mean? Why are you moving around in all these different areas? Hegel, Schelling, Bible, missing division 3, etc. My hypothesis is what I want to venture. And I try to find the moments in Being and Time. All the early works, 1915, Daniel gave us that on judgment in the dissertation. Habilitatio and Schrift, all the way up to 62 on Time and Being. True time is four-dimensional. Try to find those signs and incompletions, moments where Heidegger's confessing. He's telling you, I can't do this. I don't know where am I leading off here. Chapter 5, Division 2, Section 72, temporality and historicality. Before he gets to the vogue and the community and the politics and the moment of vision and the destiny, everything that happens in that chapter 5. Before 6 on within timeness and the ordinary understanding of time, and within timeness derived from something deeper. The encounter with Hegel. Missing division 2, division 2 ends. No missing division 3. In 5, where he says, and I can bring it up here. Sorry, and I'm supposed to stop sharing and discussing, but I have it in front of me. Here, just want to make sure we see this together, and that'll give us a glimpse of what I'm trying to do. So here is Being in Time. If it's too small, let me know. But this is the very beginning of chapter 5, temporality and historicality. Those of you that know the German, I can insert that. I have the German text too. But although up until now, we have seen no possibility of a more radical approach to the existential analytic. Yet if we have regard for the preceding discussion of the ontological meaning of everydayness, difficult consideration comes to light. Have we indeed brought the whole of Dasein, the Ganzen, whole of Dasein as regards to its authentically being a whole, into the forehaving of our existential analysis? It may be that a formulation of the question as related to Dasein's totality poses a genuinely unequivocal character ontologically. It may be that as regards the being towards the end, the question itself may have found its answer. But death is the only end of Dasein, and taken formally, it's just one of the ends. What about the other one? Beginning, Anfang, birth, Geburt. And this vision between birth and death, that presents what we're really looking for. Everything I've done up to now is one-sided. In spite of all the tendencies toward a consideration of existent being a whole, and in spite of the genuineness with which authentic and inauthentic being towards death have been made explicated. So, long story short, just division 2, between ecstatic temporality, this problem of motion, the two ends he doesn't develop, the enigma of motion, the encounter with Hegel, passing through Schelling's response, reappropriation of the Bible. My hypothesis is that, okay, let's talk about being and beings and the ontological difference. Let's talk about time as a horizon for understanding that. Understanding of being is built into Dasein as a question. We talked about this yesterday, Pete. Zorga is going to be the structure of the meaning of being of Dasein. The meaning of Zorga is going to be temporality. Then it becomes ecstatic temporality. But then he tries to get to motion. Being and beings, Dasein, understanding time as a horizon for understanding being. But what about what's happening with regard to this massive event appropriation, which we never get to see? And I'm going to term that the parseological difference, the parousia. The Phenomenology of Religious Life lectures, concept of time, who-ness of time, being of time, which we get in section 81 and 83 in division 2. Parseological, what is that? Being and beings, the being of God's time, the appropriation inside the New Testament, but its destruction. He's doing that for the history of ontology, not to end up with dogmatic faith. Hegel and Schelling struggled with this, the kairos and the parousia, but to re-inhabit that space of Sein zum Tod, but Sein zum Anfang, not human birth, not virginal conception, not resurrection, not reincarnation in the Eastern traditions or the Greek, not the simplistic temporalization, the ontic temporalization. For being in time, futural, Zukunftige, and the Zukommen, letting itself come to itself, come up towards not future as in mañana, nuevo año, et cetera, tomorrow. And he's not talking about that ontic temporality. He's talking about coming towards itself. That's what the Zukunft is. It's primordial future. I'm my having beenness, Geworfenheit. Gewesenheit. But you can do the same for the Anfang, but in a different temporal structure, coming towards the beginning, not in the ontic registers. So being of God's time, as distinct from the ontological difference, has to reckon, unfortunately, whether we secular philosophers like it or not, what the German idealists and Nietzsche try to reckon with, which is this Western Christian tradition. And what is antithetical to it? What is other to it? Heidegger knew this very well. The whole book on Schelling is about evil. The concluding appendix is on the 2nd Thessalonians in 1920-21. The Zeichen of Zeit, the self-showing of time, the daylight of time. The Allgemeine Frage, before he says Dasein is existence, is the Allgemeine Frage of the Antichrist and the parousia, not the kairos. The speculative adventure to go beyond three-dimensional time and the Trinitarian structure that underpins all of Western metaphysics. That's that passage to the other beginning. I've always said this, but it requires a true speculative leap. 12:33, 15 minutes to go. I'll admit one risk in this whole project. I've admitted this my whole life, having been trained by someone like Derrida in deconstruction. The question is, I'll pose it to myself, what are you, ridiculous? What are you, baroque? Loco? How can you go back to a pre-Heidegger moment in idealism and speculative philosophy after you do Heidegger's critique, let alone Derrida's critique of that, blah, blah, blah. Yesterday, don't answer the question, live in the question. I'm sorry, disculpably. No, that's the passage, that's the event, that's the speculative leap, the Vierfalt, not mortals, earth, sky, divinity, four-dimensional time. Conceptualize it ontologically, not ontically. It requires a reckoning with the destruction of the inner context of the New Testament, re-inhabiting that space of Jesus' Sein zum Tod without the death, the resurrection, ascension, and the Trinitarian structure. It's something else. Okay, so vielen Dank, muchas gracias, and I look forward to the Fragestellung.
Thank you, Larry. I have a very simple question. The quote you had from Heidegger at the beginning, do you know where the German text can be found?
So you want for the Schelling?
Yeah, which is in the English translation of Schelling, but which is not in the German version of the text.
Well, please correct me because I don't have that with me. So I'm going to go back to the very, oh, you mean the very, very first one we was talking about climbing the mountain?
Yeah.
Oh, please. And can you bring up the, sorry to put you on the spot, but if you want to bring up the German, I'm just going to share the English quote for everybody else. I'll go to it. And if anyone wants to retrieve the German, please give us the Aufklärung. Please enlighten. So I'm just going to share the quote there. You mean this one, right?
Yes.
That's the appendix to the 1936 Schelling lecture. So it's not the actual Schelling lecture, it's the appendix in the 85 translation.
Okay.
So you're telling me the German doesn't have this?
I'll check again. Maybe they publish it in the Schelling seminars.
I'm curious about that 40, what's going on with that 41, because the appendix of 1936 in the English translation says he was planning. Do you want me to bring up the actual English work? Because I can do that and tell you where I found this. And you can see if he has some transcription. All this is on internet for free, but while we do that, we can also take, I know Akim has a question and some other folks.
Yeah, we've got to Achim in the moment.
In the meanwhile, I'm going to bring up the English translation of the Schelling lecture where I got that appendix. But the main thing is really, if you have a problem with this quote, then we can talk about that. If you don't think this is.
I have no problem with the quote. I'm just curious to see it in German.
Okay, sure. Absolutely.
I don't know where to find it. So.
Yeah. And I'm bringing up right now I'm bringing up the Schelling. Here. It is here. And please, Akim, if you want to start, then we can, I'll bring this up.
Yes, thank you very much, Rashi. Very rich presentation. Makes me want to read your presentation and instruct myself more deeply into it. And then a number of questions that come up. For example, with respect to the appendix from which you quote, I'm curious about that particular phrase where Heidegger refers back to being in time, and to which, and he thinks he didn't get further, and you said, but closer to it and to being. And there's a phrase that you have here in English, being time as an appropriation in being or of being. And I wonder what the German here is, appropriation, what that could mean. Appropriation in being and of being. Just one little question I have with this, but then also you referred to Schelling as a proto postmodernist, and since I do not understand what postmodernity could mean, since I think we still live in hypermodernity, is he still, even for us, a proto-postmodern? We still haven't advanced towards postmodernity. That's my understanding of it. And then your paper really relates well to James Snyder's presentation this morning. And I was curious about your understanding of the connection, or maybe the relation between eternity and temporality, as you see it at work in Heidegger, and as you see it at work yourself, since at the very end, with your closing remarks, refer to the parousia, and which is not a kairos. And I think, as I understand it in the New Testament, the kairos is the harbinger of the parousia. So just a few thoughts. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Akim. I do have the appendix now from the English translation, and we'll bring that up. Okay, so can everybody see this now?
Yeah.
What I'm sharing?
You should be able to see it. I see it.
You can see it, the ambiguity of question of being, metaphysics, being in time. So this is the section I took it from. Those are the 4 points about the various ways to think about time historically until we get to his time as the ecstatic between. But this is him now reflecting about what's going on with being in time. Bring closer to the motive. So there's that closer. Yeah, we have to find where in the Gesamtskala. I'm not saying that being in time has become something past for me. I've still not gotten any further. What does that mean? What does that mean with the missing division 3? What does that mean afterwards? Basic problems, 1927. Phenomenological interpretation of Kant, the Kant book, Leibniz on ecstatic temporality, Aristotle 31, Hegel phenomenology again, not absolute knowing, the first part of the phenomenology. Introduction to metaphysics, and then of course Beiträge, Schelling, everything else, 1956 onwards. But yeah, getting closer. Appropriation, this is what I meant. Being in time is the name for an appropriation in being itself. What, as you said, we need to look at the term. Being in time is the formula for a reflection within the history of thinking. Being in time is the title of a treatise which attempts to bring about, actualize that thinking. This book has its faults, et cetera, et cetera. So I'll leave this up here, but I need to get to your questions itself, and then I'll see that. I shouldn't have used that phrase proto-postmodern. That's being too cute. That's being too hooch. A little bit silly. That's the secondary kind of intellectual history. With Nietzsche and Kierkegaard, we go against Hegel. It's the beginning of the critique of Western metaphysics. That's a big issue for the postmodern age, is a critique of totality, the metaphysics of presence, the ability to conceptualize being, the simplicity of the subject-predicate relation, the metaphysics of subjectivity. So that's all postmodern. Proto means, well, simply put, postmodern had to occur in the 20th century, maybe starting with Heidegger's critique, but certainly with the French. And then whatever happens in the 60s onwards, Foucault and Derrida, post-structuralism, postmodernism, Lyotard. But Schelling's sitting way back then, early 1800s. We can't make him a postmodern. He's a bridge or germ. But the point is that the shift to finitude and the incompleteness of closure, as Derrida might say, not end, but it's closed off now. This Western structure will never be able to do anything new because we can deconstruct newness and originality, that temporality. So just, Schelling is this guy that has to be there as this root before the very, very big critiques come along. Kierkegaard, Nietzsche, if you want to throw in early Marx, etc. Kairos and parousia. What's baroque about this is to literally move away from the later Heidegger. And I know Marco and others are doing the Beiträge. This sounds incredibly naive and simplistic, like a child is talking. So I don't want to deal with Hölderlin and the polices and technology and art and the thing, and obviously all the great philosophical contributions he makes to our understanding of language, independently of what Wittgenstein will do for the analytic side, but on our side. To say that there's already something that was incomplete, not in being in time, but in this Schelling-Hegel relationship on the Abgrund, and what comes after the Aufheben of the Christian memorialization, revealed religion, the Offenbar's Religion. If you go back to that last chapter, before absolute knowing, he says, okay, maybe God is spirit, God is truth. That is going to be the Geist, but it's not conceptualized philosophically. That's still dogma, truth, destruction. Christianity is stuck with this perpetual memorialization of the God-man who dies and he's raised every Sunday. We just finished Easter. There's a schism, therefore, between the fullness of the shape that's true, but ecstatically, the future is, it's still broken from that. It's the harbinger, as you said, but parousia has yet to occur. Literally, the revelation hasn't occurred. In simplistic literal Christianity, the evangelical confession is a second coming, Antichrist, end of the world, revelation, battle, and then new creation in heaven and eternity, subsumption of time back into eternity, full reconciliation, God all in all. That's the Christian version. The phenomenologist, the destroyer of that, has to say, my thesis is not so much the theology of Kairos. I've done this in another paper, but I'm just obsessed with re-inhabiting all the temporal registers where Jesus, the man, before his passion. So if you think of John 13 through 17, he's washed the disciples' feet. It's not in the Synoptic Gospels. And he hasn't gone to Gethsemane to pray in his agony. This is the hour, please take this away from me, Father. This is going to hurt, meaning death. Oh, no, this is the hour for which I was come. Your will be done, not mine. Many, many temporal structures going on there between his Sein zum Tod and temporality. But even before that, he's done talking to human beings, the disciples. He's talking to the Father, and it's like one long suicide note. He's talking about himself in the past tense. I don't want to get into the intricacies of the Koine Greek. I'm no longer in the world. Give me the relationship that I had with you before the founding of the world. I've overcome the world. There's some kind of temporalization going on there. The speculative metaphysical appropriation, eignen, of that structure of temporality but antithetical, meaning you don't, the projection and the being towards birth, this is my point, as an ontological difference from what you get out of the Christian confession. Because as Hegel says, it's all Vorstellung, thinking, it's picture thinking. We see the movies, we read the Bible, we look at the story, okay, he gets arrested, then he dies painfully, and they put him in the tomb, he's sealed, nobody sees the Auferstehung. And then he comes out, he's talking to his disciples, then he ascends, and then both, if it's Catholic, both the Father and the Son send the Spirit. If it's just Orthodox, just the Father sends. Then you got the Trinitarian structure, then the history of the Holy Spirit at work in the earthly church, and then the waiting of the second coming. Hegel and Schelling have already tried to destroy this thing. They couldn't articulate what's beyond it. Neither could Nietzsche. I think Heidegger carefully tells us that, look, as a phenomenologist and a careful reader of attunement to what the Vita Holum of the tradition is sending to us, sending a being, what we have to be attuned to, the hovering, is that in how do you guys say this, Hakim and Elena? I keep saying Elena. Blumenberg's Besetzung, not Überwindung. Can you say Besetzung?
Umbesetzung, yeah, I
Yeah.
think you can say that, yeah.
So you reoccupy the structure of the Frage, but you empty the Antwort, the answer positions that you get from medieval Christianity and dogma of Christian confession. So therefore you re-inhabit the space, and what you articulate is something else. And for me, this is going to sound crazy, but I don't want to let the physicists and the human sciences and the social sciences talk about time. Philosophers, which Heidegger knew, that you have to get away. It's not like I read that section. It's not about being towards death only. That's not the Ganzenheit of Dasein. That's only one end. I have to get to the Anfang and the Geburt and this Vision and the Streckung. Motion. That's the most difficult problem in the history of Western thought. Not time or being. Motion, energeia dunamis. He says that in the Aristotle book. He said that in 1922. He's saying that in Being and Time. I'm sorry, it's about the enigma of Bewegung and Bewegtheit, not temporality, not Zeitlichkeit and Zeitlichkeit. So movement, dynamis, but anti-Christ ontology, inhabiting the space of Christ before his death and resurrection. That's where the missing division 3 distinctions will be created, being of God's time. I'm promising a lot.
Well, thank you very much for your presentation and your answer to the questions. As usual, we've been talking about time. So
You have to make time for the other group. Yes. Thank you very much for that. Thank you both Alfred and Hakim, and thank you all for listening to my talk. I appreciate it. I hope we have a chance to talk again.